So I hope everybody can hear us on the microphones there. If you can't, please let us know if there's any technical difficulties. I want to welcome everybody. I know it's a small crowd. Maybe it's better because we'll have if there's questions or concerns, we can have a nice, discussion about what we're headed into. So for you folks.
So Sean gets more than one question?
No, he still only gets one. He's got to share his one question with Johnny. No, you're sharing question. You should know the way that feels. So we welcome you here. This is our second public workshop. There's an effort underway to establish a groundwater marketing strategy for our subbasin under some grant dollars that Tulare Irrigation District has received. So our irrigation district is administering the grant in the process, but we're really developing it for the whole Kaweah Subbasin and all the farmers and landowners in the subbasin that would like to use it. With that being said, I think what we want to do is just go ahead and get started, and we can take questions as we move along. We do have some kind of logistics to go through, so I'll turn it over to Craig Moyle to go over those logistics first.
Thanks, Aaron. So let me get this to move forward.
Okay. Can we just manually do it? Did it should turn off?
Okay.
Side button on the side. Yeah, it's on.
Okay. So for those of you that are joining us online, I'll be adding everyone as they come in. We're doing interpretation services for today's meeting. And for everyone who is on the Zoom link, they do need to choose which is their preferred language. So you will see at the bottom of your toolbar is a little globe and an interpretation. And in there, you will select that and you'll select your preferred language. And if you have any needs on that, let us know. Brittany, do you want to go ahead and do the interpretation for us? Brittany, are you there?
You might not be able to hear her, right? Because she's in the interpretation.
Hello.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, can you introduce yourself, Brittany?
Hello, everyone. I am the Spanish interpreter for today's meeting. I wanted to give you guys all a warm welcome. I'll be providing instructions on how to access the Spanish channel in Spanish and in English. So for those of you that speak only English, you can choose your English channel. You can go to the bottom, you'll see the toolbox where you'll see language interpretation. You'll select English. And for those of you that speak Spanish, you can select Spanish. Gracias a todos por unirse a la reunión. Nosotros tenemos interpretación. Lo que pueden hacer es pueden acceder al lenguaje abajo en las herramientas y usted puede seleccionar el idioma que mejor le corresponda. En este caso será español. Puede poner mute original audio y después finalizar o done. Gracias.
Okay, so we do have a small group here in the room, depending on how many people we're going to have here. We were thinking if you wanted to provide questions during the presentations, you can fill out the comment card, and then we'll get those over to Aaron or Matthew to respond to. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of the meeting. Also, for those that are on the virtual attendees, if you want to use the chat box, feel free to do that, and then just submit your comment or question, and we'll get those over to Aaron and Matthew. Or you can raise your hand, and then we'll ask you to unmute your microphone. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Aaron. Well, Matthew.
Yeah, sure. So we'll do, this is a little bit funny, we'll do introductions in a second, but just in terms of what we're here to discuss today, there's sort of three big items. One is we want to provide a brief recap of the public workshop that was held October 27th of last year. And if these today weren't a part of that. And then, so that's recap. And then there's two things we want to bring you up to speed on that is work that the committee has done over the last year. One was to develop a set of guiding principles. What is it that we hope to accomplish with the water market in the sub-Kaweah Basin? What are the things that we want to avoid? So what are the principles that will guide decisions about alternative strategies. And then those have already been applied to start making decisions about the specific rules, structure, operating mechanisms for a potential market to be implemented during the current water year. And so 3 and 4 will be the big items. We'll briefly talk about what's next and then just open it up for Q&A. So that's the general plan. In terms of introductions, so my name is Matthew Thienup. I work for a company called Environmental Market Specialists that is involved in the design and implementation of groundwater markets in California. I'm an environmental economist by training and have actually been running a Sigma implemented groundwater market for the last 5 years. I've been the exchange administrator for one in Southern California.
My name is Aaron Fukuda. I'm the general manager of Tulare Irrigation District and also the interim general manager of the mid-kaweah Groundwater Sustainability Agency. My background is civil engineering, but been in the district engineering role, doing projects and stuff for the district, and stepped up in the management role here about 3 or 4 years ago. And our growers are interested in why they pursued the grant. As they know, we're going to go through these cutbacks that we're seeing right now in groundwater. Having an extra tool in their toolbox to help each other out during trying times. They were looking forward to having that tool. So that's why we applied for the Bureau of Reclamation grant and pursued the program. Next, maybe Craig, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, this is Craig Moyle with Stantec Consulting Services. We're assisting the TID and the other GSAs and implementation of their water marketing strategy with Matthew Thienup. Also with me today is Kendra Clark. She's taking notes.
I also have Jeremy Barrow here. He's the guy that does all the behind the scenes work for the irrigation district. And then we do have a committee member here, not to put him on the spot, but Craig Wallace is one of our committee members, and I'll highlight the committee members for you here in a minute. So
You want to give folks in the room a chance to introduce themselves?
Introduce yourself.
Lucy Poirena with the Galveston Farming Company.
Welcome, Lucy.
John Neely, Delta Water Association. Sean Corley, Lakeside Irrigation Water District.
Okay, that's for the farms.
Great. I know we have a lot of people online, but it's going to be tough to go through everybody online.
So the first thing we want to talk about today is just a brief recap of what was discussed in the public workshop. So Colin, Lucy, Sean, and Johnny, were any of you at the public workshop a year ago by any chance? A couple of you were, okay, good. Okay. A couple of you are great. Some of us, one of you was lucky enough to be in Montana, but okay. So anyway, so there were 3 big elements to that workshop. One was just talking about the grant, how we got here, the grant, and then the organizational framework that the grant produced, and the scope of work that the committee and the Stantec team that I'm a part of are facilitating. And so we'll review that briefly for you. The other one is that Craig already hinted at this, he stated explicitly on a slide earlier, we want your input, we want to hear from you. And so we made that same, we proclaimed that at the workshop as well and discussed ways to participate. So we'll review that briefly. And then the other big thing that we did was we provided an overview of existing markets and strategies. So the Stantec team has been looking at about 24 water markets in the Western United States and around the world. From those, we selected a little more than a dozen that we as sort of representative markets that have different alternative strategies. And so we sort of gave an overview of what's already being done in the area of water markets in various parts of the world. And we'll very, very briefly share that with you. Now to review the organizational framework, Aaron.
So we had a very thoughtful process as to how we're going to put a water marketing strategy together. There was a lot of fears and hopes at the same time about what this could be or what it could possibly entail. So the structure of how we put it together was fairly important. So as you can see here, the Water Marketing Strategy Committee, which I'll go through the names here in a minute, is the core group that's being asked to put together the strategy, the main input. And that is a cross-section of the sub-basin representing the various industries, ag, municipal, disadvantaged communities, urban, industrial. So that input comes in to make the decisions. The public and the groundwater users are allowed to participate in that public process, and it feeds over to the 3 GSAs that are participating. Supporting the work that the water marketing strategy committee is doing is our project coordination team. So we have the grant administrator, which is Tulare Irrigation District, working with the 3 GSA managers that meet regularly to support the water marketing strategy committee. And below that, under contract are the legal team, which comprises the 3 legal counsels of the 3 GSAs. Stantec, who was hired under the Bureau of Reclamation contract to develop this work, and will be putting the water marketing strategy together, the physical paper product. And then we have the engineering team, which is largely supported by the engineers that are doing our groundwater sustainability work, namely Provost and Pritchard out of Visalia and Montgomery and Associates out of a mixed bag of Central Coast and Arizona folks. So that's how the whole process is supported there as we develop our water marketing strategy.
Can I interject too? One of the most important goals, as was outlined in the request for proposals from consulting teams, so from the grant itself, and one of our primary goals as the consultant is really to facilitate a stakeholder-driven process. So the idea is, you can have water market experts build a water market and nobody will use it, right? Because nobody knows conditions on the ground, nobody knows water use better than the stakeholders here in the basin. And so we set out trying to have a stakeholder-centered process, and that manifests first and foremost in the way the committee is constructed. So you'll see that momentarily. But the idea was to have the broad spectrum of stakeholders in the Kaweah Subbasin represented. And in that sense, then the public can both participate in those committee meetings directly, and we have had the public attend every one of those meetings. And also you can, if you represent a particular stakeholder group or water use, you have a representative on the committee that you are encouraged to reach out to and work through as well.
Perfect segue to the committee itself. Seems like our slide advancer. Oh, you know why? Because you're in the Zoom window. Yeah. Yeah. So you can see from the list of the committee members. So we did do a broad spectrum solicitation of representatives. However, we started with the 3 GSAs, and there we go. We have our GSA rep show up just on time. Hey, Joe. So Joe Cardoza is a board member on the Greater Kaweah GSA and also on the committee. So that seeded, and Scott Rogers with Tulare Irrigation District. So that seeded the original water marketing strategy, and then we solicited a broad representation from across the Kaweah Subbasin, across the industry, and also geographically. So we weren't just looking for like a whole bunch of people within one zone. So we have representatives from throughout the Kaweah Subbasin, from Soapy Mulholland in the environmental seat for the Visalia area, all the way up to like Chuck Nichols is out in the Hanford Tulare zone. And then we've got Matthew Watkins representing the more east side citrus ground out there. So this collective of individuals is tasked with informing and directing the development of the water marketing strategy. And that team below, the engineering, Stantec, and legal team, supports the committee. So I think as we go along, if there's any questions, we can come back to this at any point in time. Great.
All right, so the scope of work that this group, that the committee is working on and that the consultants are providing guidance on is this. And so the very first step was researching existing markets and strategies, which we covered in the previous workshop, identifying buyers and sellers and what it is that would be traded. So who is it that might have water to sell? Who is it that's going to most need water? And then what is the allocation system by which water, the right to use water is allocated so that it can also be transferred. Then very practically, the scope of work includes developing specific terms, standards, rules, and procedures for what we're now calling a version 1.0 market. And so the idea here is that we know this thing is going to change, right? We know we're going to learn a lot as we go, and in the very first year, we'll learn things that we didn't know, and that over time, the actual rules and procedures, we anticipate that those will change, but the group will create a specific proposal for that version 1.0 market. And then also to analyze water rights, actually talk about legally, how do you implement this thing? Once we've designed that water market, how do you implement that here in the Kaweah Subbasin? And so analyze water rights and develop a legal framework for that market. Now, each of these things represented in the bullet points will then actually be put together in a water marketing strategy document. And so this is a record of all of the information that went into the decisions, the specific decisions that were made around alternative strategies, a description of what this version 1.0 market looks like, how it will work, what the legal analysis underpinning it is, so that at the end, this document can be presented to each of the GSAs for a thumbs up or thumbs down vote. Either yes, they want to implement this market in their GSA, or no, they don't. And so that's the vision for what this group will produce, and then how it will be used. So to be presented to the GSAs. In terms of what we've mentioned, we want input in terms of what's been done so far. There have been 10 strategy committee meetings thus far, where that core group has gotten together on 10 occasions, and the public has joined us in every single instance. There was one public workshop on October 27th. Obviously, we're here today. And then there's also office hours. So following each public workshop, we recognize, first of all, there might be people who can't be here in the room or can't be on Zoom at the specific date and time that we designated. We also realize that there's people who might not like this forum, who want a different setting in which to interact with us. And so we've held an office hour after each public workshop. So on November 10th, we did this. We'll do this again on October 26th, where the members of the Stantec team will just be, we'll meet by Zoom. We'll be available by Zoom. You can drop in, share your thoughts, tell us, are there things that you're worried about? Are there questions that you have about the process or what it is that we're producing? And so those office hours are an excellent touch point where the public can offer further input. Now, if all of this stuff, if you would like to learn more about what's been done, the public workshop and each of the committee meetings have been recorded. And so all of that information is available here using the QR code that you see on the screen. So that, this is also housed at the Tulare Irrigation District's website. And so you can also navigate to it through Tulare ID. All right, so the last thing that we talked about last time in the previous public workshop was this overview of existing markets. So I mentioned that we did research on about 24 different water markets. It turns out that some of them are very similar to others. And so we tried to cull that group of more than 24 down to about 15 or so representative water markets, right, that employed various strategies. And so we covered that in quite a bit of detail at the last public workshop. There's a great summary of this, which is provided in the existing markets chapter of the strategy document. But you see here, we have this represented sort of diagrammatically here. You get a sense, we're not going to talk in detail about these various steps, but so you have a sense what it is that we looked at. We looked at how were these markets created, right? We looked at a number of adjudicated basins that were created through litigation here in California, and then a number of other basins that were formed that had different origins, government action, collective action on the part of water users, et cetera. We then looked at how is water allocated? How is it that the different exchange quantities are generated within those markets? How do they monitor water use? What are the specific market structures that are employed, whether they're formal or various forms of informal markets? How price information is communicated, what the term of transfers is, and then very importantly, how these various markets try to anticipate and avoid adverse impacts, either to third parties, to people who aren't party to a specific transaction, to the basin, to the environment, or to sensitive water users. And so all of that is summarized here in this chart that I just showed, and will be written up in detail in the existing markets strategy. So I'll come back to this chart a little bit later in terms of how we've applied this. But I encourage you to review that previous workshop recording if you want to learn more about that review of existing markets. You see here, here's the whole chart, start to finish. All right, so today, in terms of updating you on the work that the committee has been doing over the last year, since the last public workshop, the very first thing we want to talk about are our guiding principles. So when we set out at the very beginning, we understood that we needed to solicit input from all members of the committee and all the stakeholders regarding what our goals are, what it is that we hope to achieve through the implementation of a water market, and what are the things we need to avoid as a result of transfers of pumping. And so we spent quite a bit of time working on these guiding principles with the idea is once we agreed on what those principles were, it would make it easier to look at a menu of different water market strategies like this and actually make discrete choices. Do we want a formal market or an informal market, right? What are the mechanisms and rules we're going to use to avoid unintended consequences of transfers, right? So this is a gigantic menu of different choices. There's a lot of different ways water markets are implemented around the world. And so these guiding principles became very important to laying out a framework for those decisions. So in one of the committee meetings, we did what's called a Jamboard exercise, where we simply we provided the prompt, you see here, second line down, what should the water market strategy accomplish? Committee members and the public actually submitted specific answers to that. And what you see here is, when somebody said the market should provide equitable trading policy, right? If somebody else wanted to reinforce that particular goal, they could put a check right there, right? And so you see some of these have a number of checks. We're trying to avoid redundancy, having the same comment made repeatedly. And then of course they could also disagree, right? So we also provide an opportunity for committee members and the public to disagree with someone's answer to the question, what should the market accomplish? We also encouraged the public and the committee to provide input regarding what it is that the water marketing strategy should avoid. What are the things we're worried about? And again, you see here, there were a number of comments that were made. Now, all of those responses were then compiled and we looked for patterns where comments were overlapping and where, for example, here we recorded how many people agreed with that goal. All right, and so you see here, these are ranked by accomplish or avoid, what it is we want to accomplish or what it is we want to avoid. And then we started to define specific guiding principles that embodied each of these original comments. And so we distilled all of that input into a list of specific principles that we thought represented the comments that were made. We then brought that list back to the committee for further refinement. We also, beyond the committee exercise that we did, we also collected information at a public workshop, and there were a number of comments that were made that in many cases actually reinforced comments that had already been collected in the committee exercise. So those various things came back to the committee, and then we spent 2 different committee meetings actually discussing and debating the specific principles. Is this something the committee in fact wants to adopt as a formal guiding principle? What do we mean by that principle? When we say flexibility, what does flexibility mean? When we say adaptability, what does that mean? And so these were laid out so that you see all of the principles, the guiding principles here, which the committee unanimously adopted. And so you see here, I'll go through these just by name at first, and then we can talk about these in more detail, but they're flexibility, adaptability, transparency, do no harm, equity and inclusion, and one basin-wide strategy. I'll just mention this one because I don't know if there's a slide that elaborates on this one, but the idea here is that this committee will produce a water marketing strategy document that will be a proposal for one market structure, one set of rules that again will go to each of the 3 GSAs for their either approval or their decision to not implement. Right, so they'll get a thumbs up or thumbs down. So real quick, I want to check in, Aaron, or the committee members. Anything else you think is worth adding at this stage before we dive into the guiding principles? Yeah.
Last one, plan to be submitted to PSA.
So the goal is for early 2023. Yeah, so to be implemented during the current water year. Anything to add, Aaron?
You know, the only other thing I would add is that I don't know if I heard it, but it was unanimous. It wasn't one person, one holdout vote. The full list was unanimous.
Yeah. All right. So what do these things mean? All right. So obviously the primary goal, the reason to even engage in this entire process is to create flexibility for water users. Right? So we understand that that there are new regulations provided through Sigma, and that necessarily there are going to be changes to water availability that have very strong implications for don't hesitate to at this point. Right.
Also online, if there's anybody, I see we do have some, do we have comments in chat?
I'm just looking at that now. Can everyone hear us online right now?
No, we lost audio for when the question was asked from the audience.
Well, what we're indicating is if there's anybody that has any, we're going to go through these items, and if there's any comments or concerns, we're allowing time between each one, and if there's anybody online that would like to provide some feedback, we'd appreciate it.
Right. And flexibility is, in a sense, the most straightforward one. Obviously, that's the whole goal for engaging in this process, is to create flexibility. A really important one is adaptability. And I would say there is some hierarchical order to this, right? There's a reason flexibility is first. Adaptability is pretty important, right? So the water market strategy should promote adjustments in practices, rules, and procedures as conditions change and as the experience of market participants grows and new information becomes available. So this operates on a couple levels. First of all, one of the admonishments that I got when I was working with stakeholders in Southern California to implement a groundwater market was, you have no idea what you're doing. So we had invited professionals from around the world who had run markets in other places, and they said, literally every time you turn around, you're going to discover something you didn't know, and that water markets are complex, and that they should be implemented sort of with a spirit of humility, right? Acknowledge that you don't know what you don't know, and then create a process so that you can learn and adapt. And so the committee also found that persuasive. And so the goal here is to start simple with this version 1.0 market, and then create a system that anticipates that we'll learn more information. More information will be information provided by market participants and the experience that they're having in the market. It'll also be more information will become available about water use, water availability as the years go by. And so the idea there was to produce an adaptive strategy that anticipates change, right? None of this is fixed. And at least once a year, you can totally change the rules. So the third principle is transparency. And what we mean in this particular case is that the process of developing the strategy and for conducting market activity should be visible and understandable to interested stakeholders. So this is interesting because there's two pieces to that: developing the strategy and then actually conducting market activity. So the process that produces the market should be transparent and understandable to interested stakeholders. And then the actual market activities, should a GSA adopt the strategy, implement the market, that it should be out in the open, visible to interested stakeholders. The process for trading. And transparency here, of course, Also includes the availability of accurate and reliable water use data and the timely reporting of actual activity in the market, transfers of pumping, should they happen. All right, very importantly, one of the guiding principles is do no harm. And so acknowledging first that markets are complex, moving water, moving pumping has the potential to have unintended impacts to third parties, to people who aren't actually party to the transfer, and that some of those adverse impacts could also happen to disadvantaged communities, groundwater dependent ecosystems, small farms, relative to larger agribusinesses. And so there was an understanding, we heard from committee members and stakeholders that we needed to try and anticipate and then mitigate unintended consequences of transfers. It's interesting too, this is one that's come up again and again. Aaron was part of a process with the California Water Commission who set out to provide guidance for GSAs who are implementing water markets. And this is an issue that they put a huge emphasis on.
I think it goes beyond trying. I think the guiding principles indicate that we shall.
Yeah.
It's not a we should, it's we shall.
Yep. Yep. All right, we'll talk about how that manifests in a little bit when we talk about version 1.0. And then equity inclusion. So the water market strategy should be developed with an open process. That includes the full range of potential market participants and other interested parties. And then implementation of the strategy should be relatively simple and understandable, right? So this thing, the sort of essence of equity and inclusion is that both the process to design the market and to participate in the market needs to provide open access to water users of all kinds, right? A small family-owned farm should have every bit as much access to market activity as a large agribusiness, et cetera. Right?
Well, and what was, sorry to interrupt.
Please.
Well, as important, actually, what's come out is that the disadvantaged community and or environmental community should have equal access to potentially use that market also.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. Yeah, so this is worth commenting on further, which is that, if we go back to do no harm, one approach could be, well, we need to protect environmental water uses. We need to protect the environment. We need to protect disadvantaged communities so they're not harmed. This one actually says, no, we should aspire to build a market where disadvantaged communities and environmental water uses could actually participate, stand to benefit from market activity. All right, and then one basin-wide strategy. I wasn't sure I had a slide or not for that. So the idea is to not produce a different structure for each of the three GSAs, to produce one basin-wide strategy that could be implemented or not by each of the GSAs. So
that doesn't, I apologize again.
Please don't apologize.
Remove the potential for the committee's goals to put one strategy together. But each GSA will take that one strategy and then say, well, yes, but we have this one unique issue in our GSA, and we need to make sure we get that covered. So it can be adapted to the individual, but this committee's charge is one document. They're not charged with creating 3 different strategies.
Yeah. Comments or questions? Yeah, Sean.
My question is, how much of this has been vetted through legal counsel of all 3 GSAs?
They're all part of the process, and they're at this point in time, they're beginning to evaluate the questions that the committee is.
So they've been actively involved in the process.
The early presentation started with the legal approach. So we started with a legal perspective, and part of that legal perspective was what you can and cannot do, or what you should and should not do. They often don't line up. So that was one of the key principles we found out was, in order for you to have a market, everything is probably not going to go exactly. But if we all agree to it, because we need the flexibility of the other things, then if we achieve sustainability, have we not met that goal?
So they have been involved. In fact, there was a legal presentation even before the Stantec committee, I think, was formally involved.
Legal presentations, one prior to starting the work with Stantec, and then we brought Stantec on board, and then we did a follow-up that was more market specific. So we did a water rights presentation beginning, and then we did a water rights market presentation later.
Yeah, and then right now at this stage, there's actually direct feedback where the Stantec team is working with the legal team, and there's sort of a feedback loop where we're providing, here's the basic structure, and then they can provide, well, okay, this parts of that sounds really good. You might need to think about this. And so there's a feedback loop, and all three GSAs are represented. Yeah.
So the intention is vis-a-vis the water dashboard to make the transfers possible, following the rules even between some basins.
Well, so in a moment, just so you know where we're headed, in a moment, we'll talk about the specifics, where those guiding principles have been applied to make choices about a specific strategy for this next water year. This next water year, the vision is simply, it'll be GSA specific, right? One of the ideas about developing one strategy for all three GSAs is that sometime in the future, GSAs could work. It actually requires legal opinion that GSAs can trade water, but the idea is in the future they could coordinate the effort to entertain interagency transfers. But the vision for this next year is just GSA specific. Yep, for this next year. Other questions or comments? Johnny or Lucy or Colin?
Is there anybody online with a burning question or comment? Go ahead and unmute yourself. We've got plenty of time and so the guiding principles are key to the approach.
No hands been raised yet.
Okay, we'll keep going.
Great. All right, so there they are again, all in summary. And again, now how we used this, we're gonna transition now into talking about what this version 1.0 market will look like.
Yeah, maybe give the group a quick introduction into what we're the version 1.0, and I guess they can hear me from here. So the committee was going through a process, a lot of discussion, a lot of presentation. It came down to the point where, given we're in a drought situation right now, I mean, we're facing declining groundwater levels. We are projecting drought into the next year too. Those allocations and those groundwater reductions are necessitating an accelerated path towards doing something, so the growers have some flexibility. So what was agreed upon was, instead of a long drawn out discussion and process to develop a water marketing strategy, the request was, can the team put together a quick straw man proposal? So throw up something that looks reasonable, and then we'll tweak it into version 1.0. So we began that process about 2 months ago, and we put a straw man proposal up. I will be very honest. That meeting was the fastest meeting we got to.
Yeah.
And because when you start doing the work, some of it's just common sense and practicality. And eagerness to get something going. So what we're going to discuss here is the work that's really been ongoing for the last 2 months or so, what we're calling version 1.0. Again, remember, our program has to be adaptable. So we envision 2.0 in a year or so. So what you're going to hear is the work that's been agreed upon in the last 2 months, and we'll get incorporated, Joe, into that document by the end of the year, and something for each GSA to chew on going into next year.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting is the timeline was originally anticipated by the grant was quite a bit more drawn out, right? That this document would be put together. We talked about doing, I think the original scope of work anticipated doing some sort of like desktop exercises where we tested market rules and saw how people would react in sort of a hypothetical environment. But the urgency of the alternative to doing that was to actually sort of do a pilot market, actually do a test market this year, start learning by giving water users flexibility. And so that's where we're headed. So this is a strategy that could be implemented in the current water year. All right. And so in terms of how we got to what you're about to see is we took those guiding principles that the committee had agreed upon, and then we applied them to the various alternatives that we identified in the existing water markets analysis. And so, for example, there's various market structures that are employed in California, the Western United States, and around the world. There's formal market structures where where they use auctions to transfer individual pumping allocations. There's clearinghouses that almost look like a formal exchange, like a stock market exchange, where every single day transfers can happen, right? So there's a range of formal alternatives, and then there's various informal markets, right? Like a coffee shop where two water users just meet at the coffee shop. Hey, I need a little water. Do you have some? Yep, I've got some water. Okay, let's submit a transfer document to the regulator to see if they'll approve a transfer, right? So there's various informal structures. So there's a series of alternatives here that could be employed in the Kaweah Subbasin. And we went back to the guiding principles and said, okay, what are the relevant guiding principles that provide guidance on a choice between a formal and an informal market, and even within those categories, one of the specific types of markets implemented somewhere else. And then we did that for price information, for terms of transfers, mitigation of adverse impacts, et cetera. Right. So in each case, we applied the guiding principles. And as Aaron mentioned, the guiding principles made some of these decisions very, very straightforward. So we were able to move through a lot of those choices very quickly. So this version 1.0 market, the anticipated program period is the current water year. So this is for an individual's allocation for the water year that begins October 1st to September 30th. Right, and those familiar with the allocation system, there's different types of water that various water users may or may not have access to, in particular foreign water, salvaged water, or native yield. And so for this next year's allocation, the unit traded will be 1 acre-foot of that allocation measured as evapotranspiration to be used during the program period. So when an individual water user looks at their allocation from the next year, if they have unused allocation, they can sell any number of acre feet of that allocation in the market. And an individual allocation holder can trade any amount up to their native yield. Right? So in two of the GSAs, that's 10 inches per acre.
And the other one is just a stitch.
Yep, it's very close, right? And so any person can trade up to 10 inches per acre of unused allocation in the water for use in the current water year. And these are temporary transfers, right? So you are, if someone has unused allocation this year, you're buying that allocation for this year. You're not permanently moving that allocation. So the allocation stays with the original APN, it doesn't move. And you can temporarily transfer that allocation for use in the current water year. And then eligible participants would be agricultural landowners for this first year within a given GSA who have allocation and then who are in compliance with all GSA ordinances, rules, regulations, and are current with all fees. So you have to be in compliance with, you have to be in good standing in the GSA, right? So any agricultural landowner who holds allocation could hypothetically enroll should the market structure be approved in that GSA. So any questions about any of those elements? Who can participate? What it is that is traded? How a person knows what they have available to trade? I guess it's worth mentioning the water accounting dashboard is being rolled out. So there is a central data portal where individuals can see allocation rolled up for all of their APNs within a single GSA. And that will allow a person to learn the status of their water use and whether or not they have water available. Colin.
temporary transfer, is that just meaning for that water year?
Yes, yeah, so obviously some water markets let you permanently transfer. So, if I have a particular APN that gets 100 acre feet a year, I could say you can take the 100 acre feet forever in perpetuity, right? Now, this is just for the current water year. There are carryover provisions in a number of GSAs. So that's to say, if you buy it from somebody and you don't use it, that the rules may permit that that's carried over to a future year, right? As it would be if it's on the original parcel.
We in relation to the water dashboard, we were conscientious about developing water marketing strategy, not walking into a specific platform. However, it seems like the committee, and it makes sense from the GSA perspective, we put so much effort into the water dashboard. That's the tool you'll use. That conversation hasn't been had yet with the developer of the software as far as when and how we're going to implement it. He's aware that that's the likely outcome. But he's under pressure right now because we're all under our first invoice window in the next 30 to 60 days. Then I would imagine we begin to work on the trading portion of it as we're delivering the.
Frankly, that's the easier part. The hard part is, how do you know what the status of your water use is? How do you know when you need water? How do you know when you have water? And it's one thing, obviously growers know their own water use very, very well. They know when they have. How do you know that the person who's offering allocation for you to buy actually has allocation to sell, right? And so the water accounting dashboard is actually very good for that basic purpose, which is to establish that someone actually has a need for water use or water available for trade. Other comments or questions? All right. So we also thought a little bit about what the actual structure of the market is. And so this will be a formal market as opposed to an informal one. So one of the goals, first of all, was to create a market that can be accessed by anyone, any agricultural user, right? That it would be equally available, equitably available. And so that's a formal exchange facilitated by a third-party administrator. So not run by the GSAs, but operated by a third party. And that third party would facilitate monthly auctions, right? So during a given month, that's actually the frequency of the water use reporting. So it makes sense. At the end of a month, people can submit bids to purchase allocation, offers to sell, and that those would be matched in a monthly auction. There was even some thought about the frequency of those. It was likely to be the first 3 months of the water year after the market is up and running, and then the last 3 months of the water year. We thought a lot about price information and whether that should be public or closely held. And the committee has elected to make the maximum price information available. So price and quantity for any transfer that happens as a result of these monthly auctions, right? So you would see the quantity and the price for every single one of those, but that they would be anonymized. So you will not learn who the specific participant is. And that's to say, obviously the GSAs know who the participant is, but that wouldn't be publicly available. So anonymized price information and the maximum amount of price information, right? The price and quantity for every individual transfer. Any questions about that and maybe about anonymity? Joe?
And those people who do an arm's length with one party to another party, they're across the neighbors and so on. Are they required to put their pricing?
We haven't settled that. So to the extent that there's those related party transfers, what the committee has been talking about is that it wouldn't make sense to report price information when it's not an arm's length transaction. It's just not the same kind of transfer. In terms of mitigating adverse impacts, so there are already GSA designated analysis zones. And so here's a map. I'll go back to the slide I was showing a moment ago. But what you see here is you see the East Kaweah in this sort of purple color here. The light green and the orange would be the greater Kaweah, and then the light blue and the gray would be the mid-kaweah. So you see the 3 GSAs represented here. And these are analysis zones that were established in the writing of the GSPs. Right? So these were existing analysis zones. Now, in terms of mitigating adverse impacts, what the committee decided was that, first of all, these individual analysis zones can be aggregated into larger trading zones, right? So if somebody is in the UNL here means upper and lower aquifer, but if you're in zone 30 and we've grouped all of these analysis zones into one trading zone, that someone in 30 could transfer pumping with somebody in 27, right? So transfers would be allowed over areas larger than those individual analysis zones. Now, in order to avoid adverse impacts, those trading zones can undergo restrictions if a trigger is hit, and there's a minimum threshold trigger. So if an individual zone has their water levels drop below a minimum threshold, then that analysis zone would be pulled out of the group. So let me show you what that looks like. So imagine here in number 30, 30 can currently trade with anyone in any of the orange analysis zones. And a well in 30 drops below, a monitoring well drops below minimum thresholds. That what would happen is that 30 would then be carved out from the group, and you would no longer be able to buy pumping for 27, 28, 33, and 31. The committee actually expressed an interest that it would still be advantageous to let them sell pumping to reduce the total amount of pumping in 30, but they would no longer be able to import pumping from other analysis zones. So the idea is to have larger trading zones and then to have triggers that restricts the geographic range of trading if one of the minimum thresholds is crossed. And there would be a minimum threshold for water levels as well as for subsidence. Right, so that's the minimum threshold trigger. There's also a trigger for disadvantaged communities, right? And so I'm going to go back to the map. 30 doesn't actually have a disadvantaged community in it. So this is just for illustrative purposes. But let's say there was a disadvantaged community here, like a small municipal well, and the small municipal well was getting very close to going dry. There would be a trigger that would restrict trading in 30. Now, recall that if it was a minimum threshold trigger, people in 30 can still trade with each other, but they can't buy pumping from outside. If it's a disadvantaged community, a small municipal system that passes the trigger, trading would actually cease in 30 until that problem has been mitigated. And so the idea is to create incentives to mitigate the problem for disadvantaged communities, and then trading could immediately resume once again, right? And do you want to, is it worth talking about how mitigation, what are some examples of how mitigation might happen? Or is that?
Well, it was a good point because it came up in a Kaweah Subbasin call earlier today about, well, so if a disadvantaged community well or even a small rural home well was triggered and was dry now, the landowner or group of landowners that want to trade could mitigate that individual, drop the bowls if that was available. The question that came up, which the committee is going to need to address, is, well, does that take them out of access to mitigation dollars through the GSA? And I don't think so, but we'll have that discussion. That's kind of a mitigation measure that can allow the trading to reopen again.
Yeah, and maybe very quickly, Joe.
Another caveat as far as I don't think we drill down into as far as how old of a well are we going to try to make?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Good point.
you know, a well that's 90 years old,
Yeah.
100 years old, was drilled at some point where, you know, and the water table has been well below it or near there for a long time. And
Or the reverse of that is somebody re-drilled a new well and only stuck a 20-foot stick on there.
Yeah.
And that made no sense whatsoever. So yeah, no, those are all, we're dealing with those in our well mitigation programs.
And that reminds me, Joe, the conversation we had in the last committee meeting, which was another interesting question is, well, what happens if that individual well, the owners of that individual don't want trading to resume? Could they just say, no, we're not going to let you mitigate, right? So one of the visions is that we need to create a comprehensive mitigation plan, right? We need to design ahead of time what those appropriate mitigation steps are, and how the idea is to get trading back up as soon as possible. Any other questions or comments?
Have you talked about one-way trading?
Yeah, so only briefly, right? So the market that I run in Southern California, we actually have directional trading restrictions. So we have some areas, we have a local pumping trough, we have a seawater intrusion area. And there, the idea is we want to incentivize pumping to be transferred out, right? Because that's healthy. That means actually there's evidence you can increase the sustainable yield of the basin by doing that, right? Everybody's better off. And so we employ directional restrictions on trade, and we've had some success transferring pumping out of those sensitive areas. And so at the last committee meeting, the committee said yes. So the first iteration of these rules was, no, when you cross the minimum threshold trigger, trading will have to be managed within that zone. So it'll be broken out of the larger group. But in the last committee meeting, they said, no, we should entertain directional one-way trading in that event.
It seems like directional trading would be a pretty good way to help East Kaweah's problems, because you guys have that shelf where the basin drops down. You say, you know what, you can transfer pumping out, but you can't transfer pumping in. So you can't pump anyways. But
yeah,
your allocation out into the greater where it's it only one way, then it kind of protects.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and what's nice, it creates financial incentives to do what's right for the basin.
Right.
Yeah, so that is imagined. Yeah.
Who is the group proposing being the enforcement arm of this off of these recommendations?
It would be the GSA. And so, and you'll see when we get to next steps. So one of the, you asked a great question about legal opinion, right? So the other thing the attorneys have to do is they have to design the ordinances, the agreements, so that a participant agrees to the rules and regulations and the enforcement mechanism. And so that's one of the steps the attorneys will make for the GSAs.
So I know I'm on my third question here. So my next question, and I know they're fairly recent approvals, has there been any attempt to blend the R&Rs, the rules and regulations, into this recommendation?
Well, reverse of that, the current rules and regulations that
For GSA.
yeah, actually go a little further than what we're actually developing. So the rules and regulations are out ahead. And that's just by the reality we're living in today. My biggest hope is that when we get this done, that we can bring them back together and pair them together, right? And in the current conditions, I think that's the reality that's going to happen. We didn't want to stop this process, and this process looks a little bit different than the rules and regulations, right?
Well, I just think it would be a little more seamless if you could involve some of those rules and regulations going to the GSA.
It is, other than currently where all the rules and regulations and emergency.
Right, I get it.
Actually, in my mind, not even in condition to be adopted as.
they're all version 1.0 also.
Yes, right, yeah.
It's like, it's the first shot.
I thought
We've
about-
already made an amendment.
Well,
to
but they're the
Right.
first shot, but we're gonna, this
No, but
recommendations for this year to enact this process, right?
And I thought of when the issue started coming up, yeah, that was on my mind. I was like, well, wait a second here. It's the cart before the horse. Where's the cart? Where's the horse? Really, what they're doing is they're both going like, they're both paralleling each other. And I'm just crossing my fingers and knocking on wood when we get to next year, that actually is a good time to put the two together, they'll come back together. It's a problem, it's theoretically a problem.
Morgan, you raised your hand. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Sure, this is going back to the anonymity question, but is it also geographically anonymous? Will it be published like which trading zone or analysis zone the trade is originating from and moving towards?
That's a terrific question that we haven't answered yet. It's a great question. Yep, that's right. And so again, yeah, that's a great question around. So the GSA will certainly know that. The question is whether or not. And so what are your thoughts about that?
I could see it going either way, where it's positive or negative. I think it could lead to some gaming if people know maybe they can charge more moving into like a desperate analysis zone, but I could also see it being a benefit in the GSA and the public knowing where demands are and where folks maybe need a little bit more supply. So I can put more thought into that. I was asking the question, hoping that there is a really.
Well, and the other one too, that I would think about it too is depending on how many APNs there are in these zones, is that you might also obviate the anonymity if you provide enough geographic information. That's another thing.
Yeah, that's an issue
you'll
we've
have
had in
press.
the irrigated lands regulatory program, is that when you have really large growers that, you know, are almost taking up whole sections or ranges of a township and we're reporting at that level, is it really anonymous?
Right. Yep. That's a good point.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah. Colin, you had your hand up a minute ago.
Yeah, I'm curious if you guys actually have a trigger set, or if we just said that's.
So yes, excellent. So that's when we get to next steps, you'll see that is what the engineering team has been tasked with doing right now, right? So what are those? What are the specific triggers?
Oh, okay.
If it's a disadvantaged community, so what are the thresholds, right? And with minimum threshold, it's not when you cross the minimum threshold, it's when you get within some range of the minimum threshold. So what are the appropriate triggers? And they'll also have to identify, okay, what are the small municipal wells that we're worried about, right? So what is a disadvantaged community? So they have to identify the threshold, and then where we'll measure that threshold. All right. We go back and just see if there's anything else I want to add about that. So GSA designated. Yeah, so we cross both those. And actually, so any other, I'm going to go back to any other general comments or questions. So what you see is we've decided the broad structure, right? So how will this thing work? Who can participate? What will be traded? What are the protections for adverse impacts? So those are the broad. Obviously, we haven't gotten yet into the details of specific language of rules, specific rules. We'll talk about next steps in a second. But are there any?
Daniel, you had a question?
Did you guys say how the auction process works?
We haven't yet. Nope.
Okay.
So the only vision is that so far what has been discussed is that this will be integrated into the water accounting dashboard in some level, but you know, and that there'll be monthly auctions, anonymized monthly auctions. You won't know who you're trading with, and administered by a third party, but no specific decisions yet on who the administrator will be, and exactly what the specific mechanics are.
But that's kind of the next.
Yep.
We got some middle ground questions, and I think a few of them came up today. And then I think as we get towards the end of the year, that is the immediate.
You bet.
action. We have to move into that.
Yep.
And so you will see it, and you know, I think there was, I mean, we didn't decide, but I think people are talking about it, you know, like, what does it look like?
Yep.
If you've been on our dashboard, you can almost imagine there's gonna be a section that says watermark. There's gonna be a buyer seller matchup system on that.
Yep.
For water dashboard.
But those are next steps for sure.
And you guys did say that water has to stay within, like mid-kaweah water has to stay within mid-kaweah water, and greater kaweah water has to stay within greater kaweah, right?
For version 1.0, yes.
Okay.
However, is this, yeah. So, is that Manuel or Mike? Both of you guys?
Manuel, Mike's not here today.
Okay, yeah, hey, Manuel. Man, you guys sound alike. That was this question that Sean Corley was getting at. While our rules, while the water marketing strategy is going to say within a specific zone, as the rules and regulations were developed, each one of us allow it. So it's going to happen this year. And the water dashboard can't account for it right now. However, the only caveat to that is the greater Kaweah and the east Kaweah have a kind of a two-way approval process. And the mid-kaweah has accepted that if all your land is under one ownership within multiple GSAs, you can move it in the buckets within the water dashboard. But as far as trading to another individual, like Aaron Fukuda selling to Johnny Gailey, In the mid-kaweah, that cannot happen right
What I want to buy from you.
now. I'm waiting till the right price.
We all know that there still could be gaming. Sure. Just say if I'm a large grower in the mid, the great. And I see that there's a good market, I have the ability to move it amongst my properties. I could move it to the property where I can get a market.
Or even, you know, it happens in every base. So what happens is you're just gonna get somebody that says, well, I don't need to sell it to you, but I can lease you my ground and I'm gonna take credit. And what I tell people, I said, listen, if we're gonna get into the situation where everybody's gonna game the system, then what happens is then it really ruins it for everybody else.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying that those are the downsides.
And that's why,
But if you start gaming the system and it's causing a problem, the answer is, the allocations come down. Because if everything's trading around, then all three GSAs have to lower the allocations to where we're not damaging or approaching our minimum thresholds, metro objectives.
and that's, you know, my fear was, this is Aaron, I was really afraid because as I read the rules and regulations, but there are certain circumstances that I've talked to Mike and a lot of the east side, there is no way they're gonna survive next year without the capability. So, that has to happen regardless. And I rationalize in my own mind, even if they trade it and cause a problem, the problem was there, it was literally there regardless.
Right.
So that's why
there.
my goal is to hold the ship together with no, try and keep it a little bit more structured. And then get the market up and running. And then the idea was, because it's version 1.0, we just continue to expand it and avoid really big issues. Because in reality, what I'm very afraid of is if we get a transfer, even in a 1-year transfer, that creates a problem, right? Let's just say for a disadvantaged community, the reversal of that transfer is almost impossible.
You can't reverse it. You have to just stop it and try to figure out how to move forward.
Well, the hard part was, once you make the transfer, the pumping starts, the problem exists, everybody.
It keeps going.
That there was damage caused, and the person who caused the damage would say, no, I did it under your rules. So
if I have water in my water account and I bought water from you so I could continue pumping, and I'm causing harm to your well, my disadvantaged friend here, and but I still have a whole bucket of water that I paid for. So yeah, you're stuck.
So that's my was.
So how do you wrap your arms around this thing to start it small?
That's why I think the group or the acknowledgement that if you start with a native yield, you're moving such a little amount that now we say we're going to start with a native yield, but in the East Point, you can't just transfer. You got to transfer the whole bucket just to get it.
Transfer all three.
Oh yeah, all
native and tier 1 is all you got out.
So my hope was by the time this year end, you get version 1.0, we would evaluate and we would be transferring native yield only first. East is just going to have to do in order to survive, but they could take that structure and kind of layer it over the top and add all the other buckets. It just, in all reality, you're one big, bucket down. You're in a hard cap.
yeah. I mean, it's.
So that was my.
By the way, and the committee and this strategy is not being developed ignorant of all that variation. The idea is what's the sweet spot where we can create something that will work in each of the 3 basins with minimum modification necessary.
And I think that when we got to those items up there, especially that list that's projected up there, it was just kind of like, okay, yes, that'll make sense. And then reality starts getting in these questions come up, and that's a lot of these will be incorporated in version 1.0. But if you can imagine, these are the version 1.0 questions. Wait for version 2.0 and the issues that we see between 1.0 and 2.0.
So question for mid-kaweah growers, because you guys are under an emergency ordinance.
Right.
You don't have rules and regs, so you don't have carryover in your buckets.
We do.
But you do have carryover in your bucket, okay.
So it's just 100% because what we're going to do is we said, well, we're going to do a 1-year deal, get going, and then see how this thing works. We learn a little bit just over the last 5 months. So our goal is to get to rules and regulations next year. So we're going to use this fall, winter, and then start working on rules and regulations. Take different, if you look at our emergency ordinance, it looks like we're just going to, like I told everybody, add 50 words here, add 100 words there. And then this becomes a policy within the rules and regulations. In our case, that's what our board would be evaluating.
Yeah, and by the way, too, because you asked the question about, are you doing this? Are you integrating the rules and regs at this stage? Obviously, we're working with the GSA legal teams, so that it's natural that they will be providing input on how you resolve any conflicts between the two. Colin?
Anyone agree with that we do have some additional water we can trade at 6% out. So we can trade that amongst growers, but we can't trade it on this.
Correct. Yeah, and my understanding too is East Kaweah also has some transferability where it's submitting a transfer form to the agency. You're not asked to report any price information.
Yeah, Colin, my understanding is that in the East Kaweah, they've got a formal process there, so you're going to submit a transfer to GSA, they're going to acknowledge it, but on your water down.
I'm talking Greater
Yeah.
Yeah, so on the greater Kaweah.
GSA is gonna have to be the one to look at both camps.
Yep. So in that case, there'll be two different ways to transfer water.
So why isn't this, or why are we just saying let's just say
On the native yield, because this committee was looking at the lowest threshold. Our recommendation is to start at lowest. That was the committee's thought, is everybody should be able to trade what they equally have, and everybody has equally about the 10 inches. So you're creating a framework over the thing that everybody has. If you go to the other tiers, we all have different tiers, and we have different rules, we have different prices. Now you're setting rules over, I'm going to trade you an apple for an orange. Whereas in the native yield, we're trading oranges all. So do we get to those other tiers? That's what I was saying, like in the East, I think it's just natural because they are doing it. You just basically call that the trading platform over everything.
This platform, as it stands, you can't trade from one GSA to another. So it's going to be inter GSA as it is.
Version 1.0.
Yep.
So everyone, but it will have the same amount of traditional water within the GSA.
Correct. So they could do it with. That's why we said they could do it within there. Now, like we also said, while we say you're only going to implement this within the mid-kaweah GSA, there are capacities to move between GSAs upon approval of a big. Best case scenario would have been the GSAs said, we're not, that was mid-kaweah. We are not going to allow transfers between landowners, because that's when you get into trouble, right? If I sell a crate and then something goes wrong, now I've got a financial transaction, two individual parties, and one caused the problem and the other one. So what I'm saying? You're in a transactional business arrangement that now went wrong, right? You could have 100 of them. So the idea was to only allow initially under our first allocation transfer within ownership. So Colin, you own 1,000 acres, you can transfer within that 1,000 acres. The soft spot we landed on under that hard rule was you could transfer under management. So Colin could have 2,000 acres, but only own 1,000, but manage another 1,000, and lump that together under the landowner's permission. You still need landowner permission. Now reality hit us. The reality was in the East Kaweah, the levels are just so low that the ability for you to even get a pumping credit is you have to get it from somebody else. So you're allocated 1.15. So in order to get to something reasonable for the citrus, you have to buy 1.15 from somebody else. So that's greater than the native yield. So reality is, so yeah. Best case scenario was we were able to get 1 year worth of everybody not just transferring within ownership or management arrangements. And next year we implement the native yield concept, and then the year after that we implement something a little bit larger.
So the idea was to trade the simplest thing first in this formal administered market, right? There will still be other kinds of transfers. Please, of course.
How do you exchange a monthly option? Maybe get to that.
Well, so when we say auction, by the way, so the only difference between a clearinghouse and an auction is really the frequency, right? Yeah, and so we're kind of abusing terminology a little bit. The idea is that there will be some third-party exchange administrator that operates like a clearinghouse. In fact, another decision the committee made was that in order to preserve anonymity, financial transfers will have to be facilitated by that third party, right? So for you to not realize who you're trading with, right? And so it will operate like a clearinghouse, but we can't have a clearinghouse where that clears daily or weekly because we only have monthly pumping data, right? So you shouldn't trade water more frequently than you are actually reporting water use.
We're actually in the rears. On that.
Yeah, actually, this is a terrific question Sean asked. It's because the other issue, as he just alluded, is that not only are we doing monthly pumping totals, it's arriving with a 30 to 45 day lag. So one of the questions the committee was, well, how do we handle that? Right, because you don't know what your water use is today, you know what it was. And so basically we said, well, the allocation system currently provides really strong incentives for you to be forward looking and to say, I know it says I have 100 acre feet, but I already pumped 20 of that. And that's because, so in other words, if you sell water and then end up pumping beyond that, that's
one of the advantages. There's only through 80 field.
You'll pay surcharges and
You can't do it, use it all.
You can't use it all, right? Because you're in an 80.
Yeah, I
80
remember, I
field.
forgot that was field. Well, in the native yield, you're only trading 10 inches, so
Yeah.
you still have that other bucket.
You have those other buckets that transitional water that you would have to pay if you oversell.
yeah, but it is possible someone could end up in tier 3, right, where you pay a fee and you lose the acre foot for next year. But that's a pretty powerful incentive to be forward looking, right? Yeah,
That's way worse than the penalty fee.
There was
Right.
thoughtfulness that in all reality, the market really gets active at the end of the year and at the beginning. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's usually at the beginning, right when you open trading, which is seldomly on October 1st.
You're short of water.
Yeah. And
Yeah, like when you get to your last September ET numbers in there and you're like, oh crap, I'm like 0.2 acre feet over. Hey.
Well, the beauty of that was the way the auction works, is you just go on 0.2 short and you just say I'm 0.2 short and the third party administrator finds somebody.
And we have discussed you could, we have discussed you could do the last month of trading could be 1 month after the water year ended, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Say it's 3 months before water year end. So you might, if you have half your acre style, but the other half is, you still have some risk selling any of that water.
Yep, you bet.
So I know.
Yep.
How.
Yeah. Well,
And the fact that your water rolls over, I mean, there are different rules on leave behind, but that native water rolls over. If I think that maybe I might have a problem next year or this year, and I know I can keep it for 5 years in my bucket.
Yep.
I'm not gonna sell it. I'm gonna say, I'm just gonna sit on this and see where this lands.
you may, that's right, you bet. Yep. Yep. These are great questions. And then you also have the issue, it's measured as ET. It's not water, pumped water, it's ET. Yes.
My question for you would be on previous markets you worked in, is it meter data that you're looking at? Or
It's not only metered, it's metered with telemetry. So we get real-time pumping data and the exchange sees everyone's real-time. So we know very precisely how much everyone's using.
We acknowledge, I acknowledge there are benefits to ET and there are equal detractors to ET. And again, we will learn if the market can straddle those issues, but they're there.
And actually, you should know, as a grower should know that there was just a really persuasive meta-analysis of remote sensing platforms that was done. So it looked at not just one, but it looked at a bunch and compared them where they had in situ metering. Said what was recorded through ET based calculations and what was, and agricultural water use is systematically overstated. So ET will give you a much bigger number than metering. Which means there's a natural incentive for growers to move towards metering anyway, because you'll actually get to pump more water. And then the other one is that, just so you have a sense, we did a single, it's 3 basins, but it's 1 GSA in Southern California. And the average overstatement, we were only looking at 1 ET platform, so we weren't doing a meta-analysis, but that 1 ET platform overstated agriculture pumping by 40%. So it wasn't small, the measurement error was actually really big. It's a huge range. So drip, micro sprinklers, a number of different strategies.
Yeah, but not flood area.
None of it, no flood irrigation.
And that's the 40% overstatement. Yeah, the micro, yeah. When you come into our, yeah.
Where the really,
Yeah, sure.
And what we found is that, and I won't, did you use some of the open platforms?
We used OpenET.
Yeah. So when you look at all open platforms, AeroWatch, OpenET, I can't remember the other ones, they across the board high.
Yep.
And the reason they're across the board high is because the algorithms that analyze the periods under which you can't get your measurements are not. So Land IQ flopped that equation and said, well, for all those irregularities, I'll take a field review.
And they do, yeah, so they do a lot more ground truthing, right?
They do, yeah, they're the ones that do the ground. My understanding is that OpenET, even the method that mid-kaweah and the Kaweah Subbasin was using prior to Land IQ, to David's, is 0 ground truthing. So it's taking that raw data and trying to say, I'll make a whole bunch of like calibration point changes and hope it goes across the landscape. My understanding is every time you make that calibration change, it screws up. The overs and the unders get worse, worse, worse. Yep. Turning dials in here.
Yep. Yeah. So the other shows that the monthly reporting with a delay.
And a question from Manuel Montero: is native water the only water that can be traded?
Yes. Currently.
Under the manual, under the water accounting, water marketing strategy, like we said earlier, I want to caveat that because the GSAs currently allow it under their rules and regulations. The East Kaweah and the Greater Kaweah allow it. Under, you have to seek a paper approval, right? Right. You have to submit a form to Mike. On the yeah. Yes. Yeah. So just caveat that, Manuel. Our program is native yield only here.
Yeah. And Aaron, I'm going to move real quick. Just we have 3 minutes left, and then we can stay after if people are able to. Just so you know where we're headed. So office hours 4:30 to 6. So first of all, after you've had time to process what we've talked about today, if other things come up, you're encouraged to reach out to us by email. You can also drop in here. The Zoom link is here. You can drop in on the office hours to add additional comments and questions, input, advice, whatever, especially if there's things that you think we really need to consider as we move forward. So office hours, October 26th at 4:30. Those will be virtual only. And then the next step, this relates to.
We'll send out a notice on the inter-party databases to everyone so that this link will be in an email to everyone along with links to the video from today's meeting and the presentations.
Excellent. And then this relates to some of the really great questions we've already gotten is the committee is considering some of these second order questions, getting into the details like, okay, well, how exactly, what the next thing they need to, how exactly are these auctions going to be conducted? So we've made some big structural decisions as a group, and we've kicked those to the engineering and legal team. So the engineering team is currently working on triggers. What are the appropriate thresholds and where will they be measured? Another interesting question is, we talk about trading zones where we aggregate analysis zones. It is that sort of assumes they're all above minimum threshold. So an interesting question is how many analysis zones are already at or below minimum threshold? Because that might mean it's mostly analysis zones. And then the legal team is working on general legal guidance. You know, how do we understand what we're attempting to do in terms of water rights? And then what are the various administrative actions, ordinances, agreements, other administrative actions, rulemaking on the part of GSAs. So those are next steps that we expect to work on a lot here in November. So especially with the engineering and legal teams. And the goal is to put all that together into something concrete, actually have a package, a strategy document that incorporates all of this information and then even provides things like language for ordinances and agreements so that GSAs have something that they can choose to implement if they want to here early next year for use in the current water year. So that is where we're headed. So any further, and I think we are at time, it's 3:30. So virtually online, if you need to take off, we thank you very much for joining us. Again, feel free to follow up by email or dropping in on the Zoom meeting. For those of you that are here in the room, thank you so much for joining us. We'll stick around if you have additional comments or questions.
Anyone in the Zoom room would like to ask a question at this time? Feel free to just unmute your microphone.
I actually encourage you folks too to come to the office hours. Last time we actually had we had a really good.
Including a couple committee members, which was cool, yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you all.